Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the constant tumult of New York, everything seemed to scream. Horns pierced the air like stabs. Sirens wailed somewhere, always. Shoes clattered on the concrete, hurried, never stopping. And yet, in this city that never sleeps, there was a child no one saw. Caleb Foster, 10 years old, brown skin, his face framed by wild locks of hair. His eyes were old, much older than he was. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He watched. He absorbed the details of the world, the bursts of conversation, the tense faces, the hurried solitudes. He lived like a shadow between the glass columns, ignored by millions of open but blind eyes. Every night, he returned to his refuge in Bryant Park, a secluded bench beneath a crackling old street lamp. The cold bit into his bones, but Caleb had learned not to shiver. He slept wrapped in a khaki army coat, too long for him, with dangling sleeves and the lingering smell of old leather. It had belonged to his father, an army sergeant who had disappeared on a distant mission, of whom only an obituary and this fabric, worn like a folded flag, remained. His mother, Isabel Foster, had long struggled with inner demons. One day, she hadn't opened her eyes. Caleb was 7 years old at the time. Since then, no one had looked at him. He didn't beg. He wrote down. In a dog-eared, yellowed notebook, covered in tape and raindrops. Each page was filled with clumsy but intense words. He wrote fragments of stolen sentences, descriptions, sensations. He noted cruel gestures and complicit silences. It was his way of existing. His world was ink and silent attention. That evening, winter was a knife. The wind slapped faces. Caleb had slipped under a metal staircase at the end of an adjacent alley, trembling, notebook pressed against his chest. Suddenly, a noise. Soft footsteps. He saw a tall, straight black figure, wearing a wool coat. The man didn't walk like a bum. He walked like someone who was done. Like a condemned man climbing the stairs of a scaffold. Caleb sat up and listened. The figure climbed the fire escape of the neighboring building. The curious child followed silently, his instincts taut as a rope. Arriving on the roof, Caleb saw the man at the edge of the void. He wasn't moving. Only the wind made the hem of his coat tremble. He stared at the city lights below, like a river about to swallow us up. Tailored black suit. Italian leather shoes. Gold watch. Everything about him spoke of success, money, control. But his gaze was that of a devastated man, who could no longer find anything to hold on to in this world. Caleb felt his heart race. "Sir," he cried in a trembling but firm voice. The man jumped and turned around suddenly. He saw a little boy with cheeks reddened by the cold, his eyes shining with worry. "What are you doing here? Get out. You don't belong here, kid." Caleb didn't move. He placed a hand on the frozen railing. "Neither do you," he murmured. His tone wasn't insolent. It was sincere. Raw. The man gave a bitter, dry laugh, like a hiccup of pain. "Do you think you understand anything about my life, kid? I'm Richard Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries. I have buildings to my name, a fortune you can't even imagine. And yet, I'm here. Because nothing makes sense anymore." He paused. "I lost my brother in a scandal. My wife jumped ship as soon as the newspapers started reporting. My business partners sold me out like a dog. I spent 30 years building an empire. And tonight, I realize I don't even have one real friend." Caleb approached slowly. He reached into his pocket, took out his notebook, and held it out. "I don't know your world. But I know that emptiness in your eyes. I saw that look in my mother's eyes, the night before her last night. Read this. These are my words. Not much. But maybe it can hold you back." Richard took the notebook hesitantly. He read. Slowly. Page after page. Don't sit where the city wants you to collapse. Don't think that money can mend the holes in your chest. When nothing is holding you to the ground, look around you. Someone may be watching over you without you knowing it. By the third page, his hands were shaking. By the fourth, his shoulders were shaking. He hadn't cried in years. That night, he broke down. Silently. His notebook clutched to his chest. Then, slowly, he sat down. Not to fall, but to regain his footing. He looked at the child. What's your name? Caleb. Caleb Foster. You just stopped me from disappearing, Caleb Foster. And I didn't even say thank you. Caleb shrugged. You will do it, later. So Richard came down from the roof. He didn't throw himself. He went back down. Accompanied by this little boy whom no one was looking at. And that evening, on the icy rooftop of Manhattan, a man collapsed, only to get back up again. The day after the rooftop, as frost smothered the leaves of Bryant Park, Richard Whitmore returned. Passers-by ignored him, as usual. A man in a long coat and leather shoes, holding 2 steaming cups in a paper bag. He approached the bench. Caleb was there, wrapped in his military coat, the notebook on his knees, a dirty blanket over his thin legs. He barely looked up. I thought some hot chocolate wouldn't go amiss, said Richard. He sat down without asking, without imposing. Right there, next to him, as if he had always belonged on this bench. They didn't speak immediately. Silence, in that corner of the park, was more comfortable than 1,000 words. Then, as the days passed, Richard returned. Always with something, a sandwich, a book, a jacket. But above all, he brought time. And calm. The conversations came like slow drops on a cold windowpane. From memories to wounds, Richard finally confided. He spoke of his childhood in Alabama, of his brother Ethan, whose death, he believed, was his fault. He spoke of the woman he had married to forget, then lost. Of the loneliness lurking in the glass corridors of his towers, of those business dinners where everyone smiled, except him. Caleb, on the other hand, spoke little. But he listened. Really. Not like adults who listen to respond. He listened to understand. You are stronger than you know, Richard said one evening, his eyes fixed on the reddish sky. Caleb shrugged. Maybe. But I need a roof over my head, not compliments. It was said without challenge, without complaint. Just the naked truth. Richard felt his throat tighten. Come to my place, he offered. I have space. You could sleep somewhere warm. Have some books. A real bed. But Caleb shook his head. I don't want to be a charity project. I'm not a social accident to be repaired. Richard remained silent, touched. He didn't answer right away. He understood. This child had nothing left, except his pride. He refused to trade his dignity for pity. Then come work for me, he said finally. Not as a favorite. As an employee. I have a corporate library in my headquarters. It's overflowing with archives. You'll help me organize it, update it. I'll pay you. And you can study. You'll be free. Caleb hesitated. For a long time. Then he nodded. Okay. But I want to sign a real contract. Richard smiled. This 10-year-old boy had more integrity than half his peers. Settled into a small, modest but clean studio apartment in Brooklyn, Caleb rediscovered forgotten habits, sleeping without fear, waking up to an alarm, eating hot food. The first night, he couldn't fall asleep. Too quiet. Too safe. Too good to be true. He resumed correspondence school, with the help of a specialist teacher whom Richard discreetly paid. He also worked 3 afternoons a week at Whitmore Industries headquarters, on a quiet, glass-walled floor, among shelves full of files. There, he classified, sorted, noted, read. He had his badge, his office, an email address, a transport card. But above all, he had a look at him that mattered. Not that of a charitable man. That of a man who saw him as an equal. Caleb read a lot. He devoured books on urban planning, sociology, and American history. He annotated the margins with his thoughts. He wrote even more, filling notebook after notebook with stories, reflections on the streets, the invisible people, the silent choices that change a life. For his part, Richard was changing. He was laughing. He was listening. He was slowing down. He cancelled meetings to have lunch with Caleb at a small midtown bistro. He talked to him about his business, showed him charts, reports, but also angry letters from precarious tenants, letters he'd never read before. You know, Caleb, sometimes you build an empire without looking at the foundations. You're forcing me to revisit them. He had begun to question some of his company's practices. He had launched a rehabilitation program for the social housing he owned. It wasn't perfect. But it was a start. And in the evening, he read Caleb's texts, like a father reads his son's poems. In business circles, it was whispered. Whitmore spends too much time with that kid. He's losing his mind, he's slowing down. He'll end up squandering his inheritance. But Richard didn't care. For the first time, he was no longer a man running away from his past, but a man rewriting it. For him, Caleb wasn't a charity. Nor a moral debt. Nor a gesture of redemption. He was a reminder. A mirror. A living witness to a moment when everything could have changed, and hadn't. Caleb had handed him a notebook. Richard, in return, had handed him a future. 2 years had passed since that icy evening when street urchin Caleb Foster had stopped Richard Whitmore from jumping into the void. He had grown. Physically, a little. Inwardly, a lot. At 13, his voice had taken on a steady tone. He walked upright, spoke little, but every word he spoke carried weight. He continued to write, relentlessly. What had begun as survival notes in a worn notebook had become a complete manuscript, raw, heartbreaking, urgent. A cry held back too long. He titled it, "Don't Go Up." Chronicles of an Invisible Boy in a City That No Longer Looks. The title was born from a simple sentence, spoken without thinking, on this Manhattan rooftop, to a stranger ready to die. But for Caleb, it had become a manifesto, a call. A refusal to give in to indifference. The book, published by a small independent publisher at Richard's silent request, exploded. Like a detonation in a world saturated with unnecessary noise. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a success story. It was a mirror. Raw. Sharp. When you live on the streets, you become transparent. But sometimes, it's the invisible that sees best. People didn't ignore me out of malice. But because, to them, my pain was a mess. I saw a man walking towards his death, in a suit and in silence. And I screamed. It wasn't courage. It was refusal. Every sentence seemed to come from the womb. From a child silenced for too long. The critics were shocked. The television sets invited him. The schools asked to meet him. Tears were shed. But commitments were also born. Caleb refused labels. I'm not a survivor. Nor a role model. I'm an alarm. A lamp lit in the corner you never look at. We saw him in a suit, next to powerful adults, but his gaze remained that of the kid from Bryant Park. The New York Times wrote. What Caleb Foster offers us is not a moral lesson. It's a gentle slap in the face. And a necessary one. With the discreet, but decisive, help of Richard Whitmore, Caleb launched a foundation. He gave it a simple name, taken from silence. The Valier Project. Not savior. Not hero. Watchman. The one who stands while others close their eyes. The project was anything but a traditional charity. Caleb rejected pity as a driving force. He wanted a listening ear, trust, and tools. The foundation opened temporary shelters in the formerly abandoned Whitmore Industries buildings. She set up writing workshops, where former street children told their stories and found their voices again. Speaking workshops, night circles, silent dinners where sometimes a glance was enough to break down a barrier. He hired former street kids. Not to give them a second chance, but to give them a hand, and allow them to give it to others. One day, a journalist said to him, incredulous, "You're only 13 years old." Caleb looked at her for a long time before answering. "And I've already lived 3 lives. Maybe 4. But I'm in no rush to finish the 5th. He didn't pretend to want to save everyone. That wasn't his role, nor his mission. "I just want to keep watch." Sometimes a simple look can be enough to keep someone on the edge. In the months that followed, cities, states, and mayors contacted the Valier project to implement it elsewhere. But Caleb remained wary. He refused large grants that sought to buy his image. He said, "I'm free as long as I can say no." He had an office at the foundation's headquarters, but preferred to stay in the field. He sometimes slept in the shelters he had opened. To stay close to the smell of reality, as he put it. Richard, in the shadows, watched this child become what he had never dared to be. Not a king. Not a tycoon. But a conscience standing where everyone looks away. Every year on the same date, December 3rd, Caleb Foster returned to Bryant Park. He sat silently on the same bench. The one by the old lamppost, where shadows fell like memories, where a scream had suspended death, where a glance had been enough to change a destiny. He didn't come with pomp. Not with a camera. Only with a notebook, a thermos of hot chocolate, and that old sweater Richard had given him that fateful next day. This place had become his discreet altar. Not to pray, but to remember. He didn't come to cry. He came to keep watch. Often, passers-by would stop, intrigued by the silent silhouette of a young man standing there, as motionless as a witness frozen in time. Sometimes, homeless people would approach, drawn by a familiar presence, unlike anyone else's. And Caleb spoke to them. Not with condescension. Not with pity. But with the raw simplicity of those who know. Of those who have been hungry. Of those who have slept in the rain. Of those who have known the shame of being nothing more than a shadow that no one names. "If you think your life doesn't matter, it's because no one has really looked at you," he said to one. "So look at me. You're still here. And so am I." His words didn't sound like slogans. They resonated like human truths. He wasn't handing out bills. He was offering what he himself had received, a look. A real one. A presence. A listening ear. At 19, Caleb Foster became the youngest author to receive the National Humanities Award, an honor rarely bestowed upon someone so young, let alone someone who grew up homeless. The ceremony took place in a large room at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. The literary world, media, political, and cultural figures were present. When Caleb took the stage, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, the applause was long. He had grown, certainly. But in his eyes, there was still that quiet fire, that of souls who have known the abyss and returned without arrogance. He looked up at the front row. Richard Whitmore was sitting there, his hair a little whiter, his eyes misty. Caleb smiled. And then he spoke. "I wrote because I needed the world to know what it's like to become invisible before I even have a story." He paused. "Richard Whitmore gave me a roof over my head. But more than that, he listened to me. And when you listen to a street child, you change the world." The room rises. But Richard didn't move. He was frozen. Because he knew that in that sentence, Caleb had summed up what he himself had spent a lifetime searching for. The meaning that neither numbers, nor contracts, nor skyscrapers had been able to offer him. Years later, when Richard died peacefully at his country home, his loved ones discovered a handwritten letter slipped into his will, addressed to Caleb. She said, "All my life, I thought I was building towers. empires, structures that touched the sky. But today, I know that the tallest thing I've ever built isn't a building. It was a child sitting on a bench who reached out to me when I was about to fall. Caleb, you didn't just save me. You rebuilt me. Thank you for watching over me. That evening, Caleb returned to Bryant Park. He sat down again. The same bench. The same silence. But he was no longer alone. He never was again. A group of young people joined him. Formerly homeless, now students, librarians, artists, and social workers. All of them had been through the Valier Project. All united by the same cry, that of those who keep watch, even when no one is watching. And in the icy December air, one certainty hung. Life had changed. Because a child refused to look away.